There we go. I remembered to turn the microphone on this time. Hooray! Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all again. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas and that your new year will be spectacular. Today, I have the wonderful Dr. Eleanor Dobson talking to me, which is awesome because she and I have known each other for approximately 1 million years. That seems about right. We both went to Birmingham University for our undergraduates and masters, and then I left and she continued and did her PhD there. She has a PhD in English literature and teaches at Birmingham in the English literature department, and currently focuses on the reception of ancient Egypt in the 19th and 20th centuries, which is why I got her on, because that is something I know absolutely nothing about, and it sounds really, really interesting and basically involves Egyptology and Victorians. And if that doesn't sound absolutely fascinating, I really don't know what I can do for you. You should probably go and, I don't know, watch paint dry or something. Yeah, so this is going to be awesome. I'm really excited. So Dr. Dobson, if you wouldn't mind just giving everyone a little bit of detail about yourself, maybe why you got into the field and maybe some information about your current research, that would be great.
Lovely. Hello, everyone. Yes, we have known each other a long time, haven't we?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've been at university forever.
You and me both.
So yeah, how did I get into it? Well, I was an undergraduate reading imperial adventure stories. That's how it started.
Awesome.
And I read She by H. Rider Haggard, which is a very empowering book to read if you're a kind of 19-year-old impressionable girl who hasn't read anything like that before. So I suddenly was very much interested in goddesses and female power and the supernatural. And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole with Haggard and read more and more stories, lots of them with kind of Egyptian themes. And that eventually led to an undergrad dissertation, a master's project, and my PhD on Egyptian stuff in 19th and 20th century literature.
That's really, really cool. And see, I've been keeping, like, we haven't talked for a long time, but I am a bit of a creepy stalker person, so I check up on your Facebook occasionally. And just, I didn't even know that was a thing, or like a field of study. And it sounds absolutely amazing. Is it like, are there a lot of people doing that?
I mean, it's a growing thing. So as a field, it's kind of an interesting one because you have kind of straightforward historians of the 19th century. There are literature people and art historians as well. And a few Egyptologists are getting interested in the history of their own field.
I was going to say, do you have a lot of engagement from Egyptology?
It's a strange one. So yes and no. It seems that Egyptologists are in two camps: the ones who are into this kind of stuff and want to do more of it, and those who definitely don't want to have anything to do with it, which is fine. I'm not going to force anyone, but yeah, it seems to be a little bit divided. There are lots of German Egyptologists who are really interested in it. I think UK Egyptology is catching up with that.
Very cool.
And I don't know about the state of things in the US. So
no, I don't know. I should probably ask some people. And it's something that not with Egyptology, but it's something I feel I need to do more research into, is the history of my field, because we get told bits about it during classes, but it's not something that gets focused in on.
Yeah.
And the little I know is really, really interesting, which makes me think that the rest of it's probably pretty interesting as well, and I should actually spend some time, diving into it a bit more. So, exciting stuff. So I have to ask, what was your PhD dissertation on?
It was on Egyptology and literary culture from about 1880 to about 1930.
Oh, wow, cool.
Lots of stories about reanimated mummies, curses, that kind of thing. That's what people were writing about. And Egyptologists as well, they have a bit of a reputation for not liking people asking the supernatural questions. So if you go into the British Museum and ask an Egyptologist or somebody who's kind of watching the room, making sure nothing untoward is going on, have you had any supernatural experiences? They sigh. But actually, 19th century Egyptologists loved telling spooky stories. So it's all those kind of creepy narratives that I was working on.
That's interesting. So is it were these narratives presented as like factual accounts, or are they written as fictional literature?
Most Egyptologists were writing them as factual accounts, although you do occasionally get some Egyptologists writing them in the manner of fiction. But what the Egyptologists tend to do on the whole is they'll write their story about, a mummified arm moving in the night or something, and then they will add this kind of explanation at the end, kind of saying, oh well, of course it was the change in temperature that was affecting the muscles and they were contracting, and of course nothing spooky was happening in my room
Definitely
at night.
But maybe it was, but I'm not going to say that because that's not
a little raised an eyebrow at the end, but nothing more than that.
That's amazing. I assume your research has kind of continued in the same vein since graduation. Are you working on anything particular at the moment?
I was actually this very day revising my my dissertation to try to get it into a book format. But I've done some other kind of fun bits and pieces here and there since then. What have I done recently? I've done some stuff on 19th century and early 20th century seances, and how little scarabs and other amulets kind of materialize out of the dark, and what people thought was going on there, and people thinking that they're communicating with Cleopatra and things like that, which it's very interesting why people choose to kind of make contact with ancient Egypt in the seance room. It's kind of hard to tell why sometimes. I think it's political and bound up in a lot of gender issues.
So there are people in the 18th and 19th centuries going to seances, and rather than trying to contact people that maybe they knew in life, they're going for ancient Egyptians. Yes,
people are talking to often Egyptian princesses.
Of course.
It's mostly women that they're seeking to make contact with, although you do get some guys coming through as well. But yeah, often Cleopatra. Never one of the minor Cleopatras either. It's always the Cleopatra.
There's only one. We all know that.
Exactly. To them, there's only one.
So is it women participating in these seances, or do you get men?
It was a mix. So often the mediums were women, although you do get some very famous men being spiritualist mediums. But often it seems to have been a kind of bid for women, especially women from working class backgrounds, to enter into a very kind of middle class setting.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I think that's what it's often about. So there's a lot of class tensions going on in the seance room, and I think that's why queens and princesses get dragged in as well. It's a real kind of mishmash of people in the room, from royalty through to kind of everyday people.
Fascinating. And what kinds of questions were they asking these princesses?
Often it was just kind of general, can you watch over us and make sure that everything's nice for us? To which the princesses obviously say yes.
Definitely.
There are sometimes, I suppose, questions, I guess kind of half religious questions, but nothing very specific and fully formed, which imply, that the Egyptians had it right, that there is life after death. There's a kind of eternal continuation of the soul, that kind of thing.
And so were they asking about the Egyptian version of the afterlife, or just general afterlife experiences?
I think it was very general, because a lot of these were happening at a time when more and more people were questioning the church. So people were trying to reconcile their kind of pre-existing Christian beliefs with something a little bit more thinking outside of the box, stuff that they haven't been told by a kind of usually male authority figure. So it's, I guess, testing the waters and not doing something really massively controversial religiously, but still definitely pushing at the boundaries of what was accepted.
Interesting. So you've mentioned a couple of times the the gender divide, mainly female practitioners and male figures of authority in the church. Is this almost like a form of feminism?
Yeah, I think we could read it as a kind of proto-feminist, women taking control of their own money, women taking control of a profession, if you want to think of it like that, if you become a professional medium. But one of the things that emerged while I was kind of writing my thesis was how the Egyptologists themselves were mostly men standing in this kind of very masculine, authoritative position, versus women who were kind of on the peripheries and trying to find a way into it. And I think taking this supernatural stance was often a kind of feminine or feminized way into like engaging with the field.
Interesting. So kind of almost a way to be like work around the very gendered academic world to kind of engage with the academic field, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are women in Egyptology, often but not always. Amelia Edwards is a good exception of a woman who was involved in Egyptology who didn't need no man. But there were loads of women who were the wives of male Egyptologists who were drafted to do, you know, the drawing work, the painting, taking records, while mostly their husbands got the glory for their kind of painstaking labour. But yeah, I think as single women, that kind of way into Egyptology via kind of spooky backdoor seems to be something that a lot of people are interested in.
Fascinating. So what's your favourite supernatural story about Egyptology?
Oh my goodness.
You can pick a few if that's needed.
My favourite one is Howard Carter's story that he alluded to it at times, and wrote it up once for a magazine as a kind of, it sounds like a kind of popular Gothic short story, but you know, supposedly true. So when he was in Egypt, before he discovered Tutankhamun's tomb, he saw a canary that was being sold, and he purchased this little canary and thought it was wonderful. And he took it with him to the dig sites because it sang and was this nice kind of uplifting little creature that kept everyone in a good mood.
Yeah.
And then the steps down to what became known as Tutankhamun's tomb are discovered, and the canary stops singing, and he thinks, "Oh, what's going on here?" Never mind, we found something. This is really great. So they enter into the tomb, and once they break through, it transpires that a cobra has somehow gotten into the canary's cage and eaten the canary. And they peer through into the first chamber in Tutankhamun's tomb, and they see the statues of the king with the cobra symbol on the crowns, and think it must be the spirit of the king inside the cobra.
Oh wow!
Devoured Carter's canary. But I like the story and I don't like the story because I'm an animal lover, and I think it actually must have been really horrible for Carter.
Yeah.
And he, if you look through his diaries, you see this mention when one of his friends brings the bird to the dig site, but when it dies, he doesn't mention it, and I kind of feel something for him. Like, he can't even address it himself, and then he's pressured to write up the story in a magazine, but he can't write it in his own diary.
Dead canary.
I know, so it's a sad one, but hopefully it didn't suffer.
Yeah. Oh dear.
Oh. That's my favourite.
We have. Oh, okay. So, just pass me some suggestions. He's saying, can we give a general background to what we're talking about? So maybe, like, I know this the state of Egyptology in the Victorian periods, which is something again I know absolutely nothing about. So if you can talk about that, that would be really great.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So most histories of Egyptology, if we take that concept with a pinch of salt, they usually start with or feature very heavily right at the beginning the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. So what basically happens at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, is the French have gone over to try to take Egypt. Basically, Napoleon's gone over, and the British go and defeat Napoleon. And from that moment, there's this kind of struggle between the French and British for power in Egypt that goes well on into the 20th century. And part of this, Napoleon's soldiers and scientists had discovered the Rosetta Stone, which is obviously a very famous artifact, which has the ancient Egyptian script, and it also has the same text in Greek, which allowed for the first time a direct comparison between the ancient Egyptian language and the Greek, which allowed scholars such as Champollion is the famous French one, and Young, who's the British one, to basically race to decipher the fastest. So there's a lot of national pride going on behind these kind of linguistic studies. And people describe it as the cracking of a code. It's not really the cracking of a code. It's a very romanticized way of looking at it. But the first steps in deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs are often kind of held as the beginning of Egyptology. Like, we've lost knowledge of the language for such a long period of time that a lot of what we know of Egyptian history comes from Greek or Roman texts that possibly aren't 100% reliable, or the Bible, also big question mark over the reliability of how Egypt is portrayed there. So it's people being able to, I guess, try and reconstruct ancient Egyptian history using the actual ancient Egyptian sources for the first time.
So we go kind of from having the account of Moses in Egypt and Herodotus and that kind of thing to actually being able to read Egyptian texts for ourselves.
Absolutely. It takes ages, as you would expect, because, you know, they get a few letters and it takes, you know, decades for people to actually, you know, concretely say the ancient Egyptians are saying this, and even then some of the translations are a bit dodgy, but it's a big deal. And as the century goes on, at least in Britain, we get a lot of people interested in Egypt and making discoveries in Egypt, hopefully to support biblical accounts. So there's a lot of money going into archaeology from Christian societies.
You see something similar in Assyriology, especially when, one of the most famous texts deciphered, which was also a pretty early one for our field, was a Mesopotamian flood story. Mm-hmm. And George Smith deciphered this in the British Museum, and you get this really sensational like news reporting and people getting very excited because there's another flood story. So that means it must be true. So then I think one of the British newspapers funds him to go back out to excavate, because he only found, well, the British Museum only had half the tablet, so like half the story is missing. And one of the British newspapers fund him to go back and excavate, and by some miracle he actually finds the other half of the tablet.
Oh my goodness.
It's absolutely insane. The chances are like 1,000,000 to 1, but you get a lot of that, people looking at Mesopotamian texts to try and verify biblical accounts of things.
That is really interesting. I think, you know, it must have been at the forefront of people's minds, and so having substantial evidence, you can see why people would find it, you know, really compelling.
And Josh has just brought to my attention that probably not everyone listening knows what the Victorian period is. I probably should have led with that particular question. So, Dr. Dobson, what is the Victorian period?
I mean, technically, officially, we're talking about the dates of Queen Victoria's reign on the British throne. So 1837 to 1900, I think she died. But of course, this history starts a little bit earlier. But most of the 19th century falls within Queen Victoria's very long reign. And then subsequently, we get the Edwardian period, which goes up until the First World War, conveniently, 1918 is the next monarch.
Excellent, thank you.
That's all right.
I can't believe I didn't ask that to begin with. I'm like, everyone knows what the Victorian period is, because everyone here listening went through the British school system, obviously, because all of our viewers are British. No, not even.
I expect they're not.
Not even remotely true. So you have in the Victorian period this the decipherment of hieroglyphs, so people can start actually reading Egyptian texts. Mm-hmm. And they try and match those accounts up with the biblical texts. And you were saying that alongside this, there's also the people starting to question maybe the authority of the church and what the church has told them about things like the afterlife, which leads to people, which is amazing, contacting Egyptian princesses in seances. I think that's magnificent. So what, one of the things that I read about when I was in primary school, I think, do you remember the Horrible Histories books?
Oh, I love them.
Yeah. Oh, they were wonderful. So I read the Egyptian Horrible Histories book, and it has like amazing facts about how pyramids can sharpen razor blades, which is not true, and about like the curse of the mummy. And so do you get a lot of like curses and mummies like killing people and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, that stuff is pretty much a Victorian invention. So there are a couple, and I'm not an Egyptologist at all, but I hear on good authority that there are a couple of, warnings in tombs saying, please don't disturb this mummy. Really bad stuff will happen to your family if you do.
That matches up with what I've read about.
Yeah, but they're not that frequent, and they're not, a curse will be upon you forevermore, that kind of thing. So it's the Victorians who kind of invent this Gothic narrative for the mummy, invent the curse stories, and I'm not quite sure where the razor blade things comes from originally. That's probably 20th century, but I know
it was weird. I mean, even reading it as a child, I thought that sounds very strange.
It is strange. But yeah, it was actually, I think the earliest mummy story, the earliest famous mummy story is written by a woman. Jane Loudon's The Mummy is first big one, which is set in future. It features people going into the Great Pyramid. Cheops's mummy is in there for some reason, although it wasn't. And they hook him up to a battery, and they bring him to life by hooking him up to a battery with a kind of Frankenstein-esque spark.
That's really cool. It's a Frankenstein mummy. That's amazing.
But from that point on, that was pre-Victorian. I think that's 1818 or some. Oh no, wait, it's later than that. 1818 is Frankenstein, I think. 1827, I think, is the mummy, and then after that, we get more and more kind of Gothic interpretations of the mummy until curse story that we know nowadays.
So we have not only Egyptologists writing this kind of supernatural account, but it features quite largely in fictional literature as well.
Yes, I would say it's the mummy's curse definitely more in fiction than Egyptology. The Egyptologists like telling spooky stories about amulets, or maybe an arm moving, or they take a photo of something and there's a kind of ghostly face smudge in the background, but definitely more in fiction. And you get some quite big names actually dabbling in the mummy stuff. So we get Arthur Conan Doyle writes a couple of mummy stories. Bram Stoker writes one of Dracula fame. We have Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women at the same time as writing Little Women. She writes a mummy story.
That's amazing.
So yeah, it's all kinds of people doing it. So very much kind of a trend, I think.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I have to ask you about something else that I've heard of vaguely, and if it's completely outside your field, please just tell me. But did they really have mummy unwrapping parties?
They did, yeah.
Wow. Why?
Wow, that's a good question. So, the official answer would be for science. But I think more the reason why they had these parties was for a kind of morbid entertainment, really. So it would be, there are a couple of different types of parties. There were the private ones that very rich people would show. They'd buy a mummy and they would usually hire someone to unroll it, and they'd kind of hand all the amulets around as the amulets came out of the wrappings, and people would take them home as kind of little mementos. And the other kind were the public unrollings, so big lecture theatres full of people. And yeah, it would often be, people wouldn't dream of doing anything like it nowadays, because you'd be, destroying basically an artifact.
Different ideas of ethics, I think.
Definitely, and not just an artifact, but human remains. But definitely at the time it was, they want to see what's under the wrappings. They've got no other way to see than to actually remove them. So they'd kind of hack away at the bandages until they get to the inside, and they would always, there's a kind of, I suppose, this Orientalist idea of Egypt as kind of feminine and sensual. They would always market the unrolling as an unrolling of a mummy woman.
Really?
Pretty much always. And they would get down to the end of the bandages, reveal everything, and discover that it was a man. So there's a kind of horrible striptease element as well, I guess.
God. So there's a real fascination with not just Egypt, like ancient Egypt, but ancient Egyptian women.
Yes, definitely a total fascination. I don't know if it's because I think we see, stereotypically we hold this idea of the Victorians as being very prudish. There are all these misconceptions about the Victorians being unable to look at the legs of a piano because
like having to have massive tablecloths to hide table legs because it's too erotic.
Can't about legs of any kind. But that's not true. But I think there is something about Egypt where we get these like beautiful tomb paintings, for instance, of women wearing not very much. We get the idea of unwrapping mummies and, basically seeing naked bodies in a way that's kind of somehow acceptable. And I think, with a lot of, the Victorians' relationship with the ancient world, not just Egypt, but, classical statues, for instance, you see a lot of nudity, but somehow, aside from the little vine leaf that gets put on David for Queen Victoria's visit, mostly that nudity is acceptable. So I think it's a lot about taste and about the distance, the distance in time and geography between the Victorians and the ancient cultures they were interested in, makes it somehow okay.
Is that also maybe a kind of colonial dehumanization thing going on here? Because this is like the height of the British Empire, and really the only real people are white European people. And while Egypt is absolutely fascinating, it's not actually white or British, so maybe it doesn't matter so much that we're desecrating corpses.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Definitely, you're right. There is a huge imperial element to this. And it comes out in different ways. So I think what you've suggested about these people aren't British, so we can do whatever we want. Where the British were kind of trying to claim that the ancient Egyptians were white.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So to try to take, what they hold as their kind of inheritance from ancient Rome and ancient Greece, for instance, and try and add Egypt onto that as well.
Okay, that's fascinating.
And then once they tell that story, they can say, we should have the Egyptian artifacts because we are the rightful inheritors of the ancient Egyptian stuff.
I see. They're ours, they're not yours, because they were just like us.
Which obviously is massively problematic.
A little bit.
Yeah. Substantially. But yeah, it was two camps. It was the ancient Egyptians were white, they were just like us, versus the ancient Egyptians weren't a civilized ancient culture, so we can take their stuff.
That's a really interesting dichotomy.
Yeah. And that goes on for some time. People, arguing about it well into the 20th century.
So does your work extend past the Victorian period into like more modern receptions of ancient Egypt?
I have done some more modern stuff. So fairly recently, I wrote a paper on the graphic novel From Hell, which is based on the Jack the Ripper murders. And it has a load of mystical Egyptian things in it, and Cleopatra's Needle is quite important. So I did some stuff with that. So almost, on the cusp of the 21st century, but it's a little out there in terms of most of my stuff.
Mm-hmm. So do you see a lot of differences? I know you said you've only done the one paper, but do you see a lot of differences in reception from the Victorian period to that graphic novel?
Actually, I think mostly from what I've seen, we have the same stereotypes in our heads about Egyptology, certainly from the outside, that people did in the 19th century. Like, a lot of it hasn't changed. And I think, we get Indiana Jones, for instance, coming out of the novels by H. Rider Haggard, which are 19th century and into the 20th century. So that idea of like adventurers, cursed relics, this stuff comes out of 19th century fiction, and we still get that nowadays. You know, any film about that deals with Egypt is going to have, well, not any film, but you know, there are still films being made. I saw a terrible one recently. I think it's called The Pyramid, which has kind of Anubis still living in a pyramid, and people find this new pyramid and go in and get killed. You know, it's a trope that people don't want to give up.
That, yeah, and when you think about things like The Mummy, you look at things like The Mummy, and it's kind of very, very orientalizing, and not. I mean, it's an amusing movie, but it completely, I feel, misrepresents an awful lot of Egyptology and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely true. I think with The Mummy, the 1990 something version, you know, it's based on a 1930s film, which itself is based on the Tutankhamun discovery and I think texts by Arthur Conan Doyle. So even the new stuff is falling back on sources which are so old. And I guess if it sells, people will keep doing it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it definitely does sell. People are still really interested in this stuff. One of the things that got me into the ancient world was my mum had an old photo book of the Tutankhamun exhibit when it came to the British Museum, maybe, but this is like before I was born, and she had this book, and I would sit on the floor and just flip through it, and it was absolutely fascinating because they're such beautiful and well preserved objects, and I just thought, this is incredible. I don't know what this is, but I like it.
I mean, there is a glamour about it, and I think with Egypt, you know, there's not by any means like the majority of the relics, but some of the relics are so shiny that anyone with a kind of magpie eye is going to look at that and think, oh my goodness, that's just like visually stunning. Like, it's very seductive visually, isn't it?
It's
so
beautiful.
People are still interested in that, the glitz, the glamour.
So we've actually had someone say, okay, sorry, I have another question, but before that, Josh just walked a message through. We have 52 people watching, which is awesome. If you're watching, welcome. Nice to have you. Could you please hit the like button? That really helps the channel out. We get shown to more people. If you're new and you haven't subscribed yet and you're enjoying what you see, consider subscribing. We do quite a lot of this kind of stuff. So yeah, thank you. Hello everyone. So we've had someone ask if you could give it like a basic bibliography for maybe maybe an introduction to Egypt in the Victorian period, or maybe just even Egypt and the Victorian period.
That's interesting. Basic ones. So I guess Roger Luckhurst has written a really good book called The Mummy's Curse. It's an academic book, but it's cheap and it's not written in kind of jargony language. It's very accessible. And he talks about the origins of the mummy's curse, but he also talks about the context. So 19th century Britain and Egyptian stuff in theatres, and the British imperial involvement in Egypt. So he gets that context in and then talks about mummies. So I think that's a good intro.
Fantastic. And if you could, I would write that down, but I will then forget immediately. If I'll ask you to send me that link, the description of the book, and I'll put it in the channel description, so people can go and find it. If you have questions for Dr. Dobson, now is a great time to get them in. We're probably going to be wrapping up relatively soon. Sorry, we're not running as long as normal. I have a little bit of an urgent matter I need to attend to. But get your questions in and I will ask them, and we will continue the discussion. Oh, this is so much fun. Thank you. So I would like to know more about, if you can, the gender background of this. I noticed, I was looking on your faculty page, I noticed you do work on gender and sexuality. Does that intersect with the Egyptology, or is that like a distinct research area?
It does intersect with the Egyptian stuff a little bit. One of the things that I found when I was looking at mummy stories is that there's such an interesting discrepancy between how male and female mummies are represented in fiction. So when we get a male mummy in fiction, usually he is kind of monstrous, like typical Gothic villain, not very well preserved, so very kind of skeletal. But when you get a female mummy, usually she is, the epitome of perfect preservation. She's unwrapped and she looks gloriously youthful. She quite often comes back to life as a kind of love interest for the usually British protagonist. So there's a kind of passive fairy tale princess type element to the female mummy that you don't get with the male mummy at all.
Sorry, so it's kind of like the old, like Cleopatra movies. They kind of like the historical dramas that you see, but with mummies involved.
Yeah, I think so. So the female mummies tend to be kind of love objects. The male mummies are more often monsters. So I guess there's a kind of divide between. I guess we get it a little bit in, the mummy films. We can still see that in that, there are the Egyptian women, Rachel Weisz's character and Tutankhamun, who are both kind of very beautiful looking, and we get the kind of Gothic horror stuff with Imhotep himself, who has all the kind of crumbly, like supernatural powers, I guess, that make him look more kind of Gothic. So we still get it.
As well as being less like physically monstrous when compared to the male mummies, are the women more like rounded? Like, I don't want to say rounded because I suspect they're probably still quite 3D, but they're like more sympathetic characters, maybe.
That's an interesting one. I think quite often they're presented quite positively. You do occasionally get a female antagonist, and usually if she's an antagonist, she does interesting gender stuff. So for instance, Bram Stoker wrote a novel called The Jewel of Seven Stars, and it seems to be very heavily based on discoveries relating to Queen Hatshepsut. So Egyptologists are finding Hatshepsut depicted on temple walls in male clothing, wearing a ceremonial beard, and it's no longer Victorian, but to the early Edwardians, the idea of a woman cross-dressing is kind of problematic for them. They don't really know what to do with it. And so there's this story that Stoker writes about this physically very stunningly attractive female mummy who has this kind of dangerous quality to her. And I think that comes through in her as somebody who willingly blurs gender lines. So she has a lot of kind of supernatural power. She murders people. She has a severed hand, and that goes after people and strangles them. So very kind of Gothic horror-esque. So usually, while the female mummies are quite meek and pleasant, you do occasionally get one who upsets kind of gender categories and is a little bit more unsettling.
Awesome, thank you. We've had a couple of questions. CD Horde says, what is your favourite mummy story set in the Victorian era?
I think The Ring of Thoth is my favourite. That is a short story by Arthur Conan Doyle. You can find it online. It's out of copyright. And what I like about that one is, without giving things away, it's set in the Louvre. So it's set in France. It's late 19th century, and it's about love. So there's kind of typical Gothic horror stuff, and I think Arthur Conan Doyle's short stories, although there's just a couple of them, have such a big impact on what's done later with mummies. But this one isn't too Gothic horror; it's quite romantic, so I like that one.
That sounds nice. I might have to look that up. And we have another question from Ad Brewer. Did Victorians eat mummies as medicine?
People definitely used mummies as medicine before the Victorian era. Usually they'd be putting it on their bodies rather than in, although definitely people were eating mummies or things that were claimed to be mummies. but more and more, as you get into the 19th century, it's becoming less and less fashionable to use mummy as a medicine. So usually people were, if you actually look at the sources, it doesn't seem that there's any kind of general consensus for what you'd use mummy for. You just put it on anything, like
maybe it'll work, maybe like leeches. You feel a bit weird, just have some leeches, you'll be fine.
Like you scraped your knee, put some mummy on it. Or you got a headache, rub some mummy on it. But I think, more and more into the 19th century, we don't get it being used. You do still occasionally get it being used in the 19th century for paint. People were putting mummy in paint to make this kind of apparently very attractive brown colour. So still into the very earliest years of the 20th century, you get mummy being used in paint. But medicinally, I think people have gone off the idea.
That's reassuring.
Yeah.
Although I have to say that the attitude toward mummy as a medicinal object sounds an awful lot like my 5-year-old's attitude towards plasters or band-aids. Anything that hurts, you put a plaster on it and it will be better.
There's a magical element to
there
it.
There really is. I probably shouldn't be comparing those two things. One's actually quite horrific. Anyway, that took an interesting tangent. Unfortunately, I'm probably going to have to wrap up now because I do have to run and make a phone call. But Dr. Dobson, thank you so much for joining us. This was really, really interesting.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, no, it was great. And judging by the amount of response we've had in the chat, I think everyone else found it interesting. And maybe we'll get you back on after you've published your book and you can tell us about that.
Great, sounds lovely. I better get cracking.
So thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed yourself. And remember, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?